Enough, Susan. My mother's voice quivered with raw frustration, slicing through the brittle holiday hush. She leaned across the scarred pine table, eyes narrowed, her shadow flickering across the scattered plates and half-eaten ham. The Christmas tree glinted in the corner, its glass ornaments catching the weak lamplight, but the room felt colder than the frost on the window panes. All that supposed holiday warmth felt fake, like some elaborate charade we all agreed to keep up year after year, even as the cracks widened underneath. I sat rigid, hands locked in my lap, my nails digging crescents into my palms. A storm of anger built quietly in my chest, but I pressed it down, afraid of what might spill out if I let it rise too far. Silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable, until my father broke it with his usual bluntness. "You always have to make everything about you." His words were meant to be final, a full stop. They hit harder than I'd expected, harder than any scolding from childhood. For a moment, the only sound was the old mantel clock, ticking away the seconds, indifferent to the tension that thickened the air. Let me backtrack. I'm Susan Blanchard, and I was 32 then, restless, stubborn, and according to my family, never quite belonging. It was the late 1970s, in the middle of nowhere, Illinois, where family ties were supposed to be unbreakable and blood trumped all else. Ours was a farm that had weathered wars, droughts, and the slow bleed of progress, passed from one generation's calloused hands to the next. But by then, the soil was tired, the barns sagging, and the sense of certainty that once defined our lives had begun to erode. Years earlier I'd left for Chicago, chasing a life that was mine alone. I became a lawyer, a decision that, to my parents, was as much a betrayal as if I'd sold the land outright. My brother Jake stayed, shoulders broad and steady, picking up where our father left off. He thrived under their praise, and I never held that against him. What I did resent was how, no matter what, I stayed the outsider. Forever the girl who left, never the daughter who tried to help. Since the previous summer I'd been sending money, quietly, discreetly, into the farm's account. Jake told me about the bills stacking up, the creditors calling. He asked me not to tell our parents, that it would hurt their pride, make them feel like failures after a lifetime of scraping by on their own. Understood. I didn't want to humiliate them, and I trusted Jake to use the money wisely, to keep the farm afloat, to be honest about where the help was coming from. But as we sat around the Christmas Eve table, my parents beaming at Jake, recounting all the sacrifices he'd made to keep us from losing everything, a knot of betrayal twisted in my stomach. It became clear, painfully so, that Jake had let them believe he'd been the one saving us month after month. Every dollar I'd sent had become another feather in his cap. "Jake's the reason we're still here," my mom said, her voice soft and proud, eyes shining with unshed tears. "We'd have lost the farm if not for him. He's given up everything for us." I glanced at Jake, searching his face for some flicker of guilt, some hint of gratitude. All I saw was a smug little smirk. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if watching a show he'd already seen a dozen times. That was the moment something inside me snapped. My voice came out higher than I intended, brittle but insistent. "Actually, I've been the one sending the money. Every month since July. From Chicago." The room went dead still. Dad's lips curled in disbelief. "Don't start making things up, Susan. Jake's here every day, working himself to the bone. Why would you say something like that?" His tone was dismissive, but the sting ran deeper than the words themselves. It was the way I'd always been treated, like my truth didn't matter, like my contributions were invisible. Mom folded her arms, exhaling sharply. "You always have to be the center of attention. Honestly, Susan, it's Christmas. Can't we have one peaceful night without all this drama?" Her disappointment was palpable, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I felt my face burn with humiliation and rage. "I'm not making it up," I insisted, my voice steadier now. "I've been depositing money directly into the farm account. Every single deposit came from me." My words hung in the air, but nobody seemed to hear them. Dad rolled his eyes, already tuning me out. Mom turned to Jake, searching his face for reassurance. He just shrugged casually, as if this entire conversation was beneath him. The futility of it all hit me like a wave. No matter how much I tried, I'd never be anything but the outsider, the black sheep, the one whose truth didn't fit the story they wanted to tell themselves. I saw it in the way Dad sighed, in the way Mom looked at Jake with sympathy, as if he were the victim and I the aggressor. I turned to Jake, my gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Are you really just going to sit there and lie? You know I've been putting money in the account from Chicago. You asked me for help. His expression didn't change. If anything, his smirk deepened. I don't know what you're talking about, Susan, he said, the picture of innocence. My hand shook with fury. Unbelievable, I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. But my parents were already closing ranks, determined to keep their cherished narrative intact. Dad shook his head, his patience wearing thin. Mom reached over and patted Jake's hand, as if to console him for having to endure me. I pushed my chair back hard, its legs scraping a jagged line across the worn floorboards. I stood towering over Jake, my voice trembling with emotion. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Those weren't small deposits, Jake. You've let them think you're the hero when all you've done is lie. If you don't admit it, I'll leave tomorrow for Chicago and get the proof myself. Jake didn't even blink. You're wasting your time, Susan, he said, his tone almost bored. Whatever story you're telling, go ahead and try to prove it. It was then, staring at his lazy confidence, that I realized how little he thought of me, how little any of them did. To Jake, this was just another round in a lifelong game, and he was sure I'd back down, afraid of shattering what little piece remained. His smirk was a dare, a bet that I wouldn't risk blowing up the family for the sake of my pride. But this time something inside me shifted. The old urge to keep the peace, to swallow my truth for the sake of family, was gone. I was done letting their version of reality erase mine. I looked at Jake, and for the first time I felt stronger than him, stronger than all of them. He'd underestimated me, and that would be his mistake. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The room was silent, the only sound the distant ticking of the clock, but the decision was already made. I wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. I would find the proof, and I would make them see me not as the outsider, but as the person who'd tried, who'd sacrificed, who'd cared enough to help even when she wasn't wanted. This Christmas would be the last one played by their rules. I finally realized I was done asking for permission to belong. He'd used me, spun stories to our parents, and just basked in their praise, acting like I was invisible. It was like he lived in a world where I was just background noise, a convenient scapegoat, someone to step over whenever he needed to look good. Enough. I wasn't going to let him rewrite the story this time. I was going to Chicago, and I'd make sure the truth came out, no matter what it cost me. That next morning, I woke up before sunrise, my room lit only by the weak glow from the snowy yard. I packed my bags in silence, feeling like every shirt I folded was another piece of armor. I couldn't stand another hour breathing the same air as them, listening to their cautious, careful conversations skirting around the truth. I went downstairs, my suitcase bumping against each step, and told our parents I was leaving. My mom let out a sigh so heavy it seemed to settle in every corner of the kitchen, as if I was the one unraveling all their carefully rehearsed holiday traditions. It's Christmas, Susan, she said. Her voice weighted with disappointment, like I was the one who'd ruined everything. My dad didn't even bother to look at me. He just kept staring into his coffee, muttering, "Can't go a single holiday without causing a scene." Jake lounged in his chair, exuding that same smugness. His mouth just curled enough to let me know he thought he'd already won. But I wasn't going to play that part anymore. I couldn't stay, not with everyone silently agreeing I was the problem, that I was always making things difficult. The banks would be closed for the holiday, but that didn't matter. I just needed to get out, to put miles between me and their judgment, their willingness to believe Jake's lies over my truth. The drive back to Chicago stretched out in front of me like a long, cold exile. The roads were deserted, empty except for the blowing snow, as if the rest of the world was tucked safely inside with their families, warmth and laughter spilling out of windows while I sped away from it all. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles throbbed, the cold seeping in even though I cranked the heater. Every mile gave me more space to replay the night before. Jake, so sure of himself, certain I'd just simmer quietly in the background, afraid to disrupt our parents' unwavering faith in him. But I was finished being the quiet one. I was done letting him walk all over me, letting my anger dissolve into silence. Fields blanketed with snow, frozen ponds glinting in the early light. They all whipped past the windows, but I hardly noticed. I didn't care about the destination anymore, only that it was somewhere else, away from the weight of their disbelief. One thing was certain: as soon as the banks reopened, I'd get those receipts. I'd have the proof I needed to force the truth out, to make everyone see what Jake had done. The city was still in hibernation when the day finally came. I was at the bank the moment it opened, bracing myself against the kind of cold that stings your lungs and makes your eyes water. I walked inside, the air sharp and bright, and went straight to the teller. He was a middle-aged man with a polite, practiced smile, the sort of person who's seen 1,000 people like me, each carrying their own burdens. I told him without hesitation that I needed copies of every deposit I'd made to the Blanchard farm account since July. He nodded, disappearing into the back for a few tense minutes. I waited, feeling the weight of everything I'd carried for months: doubt, anger, the ache of being dismissed. When he returned, he had a thick ledger and a small printer that began spitting out receipt after receipt. I watched each slip emerge, my name, the dates, the amounts in black and white. He handed me the stack. "Here you go, ma'am. Let us know if you need anything else." My hands shook as I took them, but it wasn't just the cold. It was the relief, the vindication. These weren't just receipts. They were proof that I'd done everything Jake claimed he had, that I wasn't the liar. I hurried back to my car, barely feeling the wind that cut through my coat. The roads were still slick, the world outside gray and silent, but none of that mattered. I couldn't wait another day. I put the receipts on the passenger seat, stacking them under the glass paperweight I'd snatched from my desk before leaving. Every time I glanced over, the anger reignited. This was what Jake had gambled on, that I'd never fight back, that our parents would take his word over mine. The drive back to the farm felt endless, the landscape unspooling in front of me like a test of my resolve. Each minute dragged me farther from the city and closer to a reckoning I'd been dreading and craving at the same time. I replayed every moment from Christmas Eve. Jake's smug little grins, the way my parents' faces had closed off when I tried to speak. I was trembling by the time I turned up the long driveway, adrenaline humming in my veins. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I wasn't leaving until the truth was out, until they finally saw me. Not just the troublemaker, but the one who'd been telling the truth all along. The house was thick with the smell of cooking and wood smoke. I walked in, clutching the receipts, the cold still clinging to my clothes. My mom was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove, her movements careful and tense. My dad sat at the table, reading the paper, every inch the unmovable patriarch. Jake was there too, leaning against the counter, eating an apple with that same smugness that made my blood boil. As I entered, they all looked up, the room going quiet, expectation and judgment thick in the air. Before anyone could speak, I walked over and dropped the stack of receipts right in front of my dad. "There," I said, my voice steady and strong, louder than I felt inside. "Every deposit I've made to the farm account since July. My name, the dates, the amounts. It's all there." My dad finally put down his paper, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the receipts. My mom came closer, drying her hands on a dish towel, her face caught between skepticism and confusion. Jake stayed where he was, but I saw the way his smirk faltered, if only for a second. This can't be right," Dad muttered, leafing through the slips, his confidence beginning to crack. "Why would you do this, Susan?" Mom's voice was sharp, but her eyes darted between me and Jake, as if she was seeing the cracks in his story for the first time. For so long she'd believed what Jake told her, never thinking to question it. But now, faced with the evidence, I could see her certainty waver. Jake said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. The smugness was gone, replaced by something harder, colder, a calculation of how quickly his story was unraveling. For the first time, the balance in the room shifted. I stood there, still shaking but no longer invisible. I had the truth in my hands, and I wasn't letting it go. I met Jake's eyes and didn't back down. "Well, Jake," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You still going to lie about it?" The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the hum of the old fridge and the steady, angry thud of my own pulse. Jake just laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that grated at my nerves. He tossed his apple core into the trash, not even looking at me, acting like this was some kind of joke, like none of this mattered. "Susan, I don't know where you got those, but they're not real. You probably forged them to make me look bad." His tone was calm, almost bored. His eyes glittering with that smugness I'd grown to hate. Mocking me, really? My stomach twisted, a cold, familiar ache settling in. I looked to our parents, desperate for some sign that they doubted him, that maybe, just this once, they'd see past his charm. But Dad just shook his head, his face dark with disappointment. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jump. "Susan, what's gotten into you?" he said, voice low and angry, the way he always got when he thought I'd stepped out of line. "This is a new low, even for you." Mom snatched the receipts off the table as if they were contaminated, holding them away from herself with pinched fingers. "Did you think we wouldn't see through this?" Her voice shook, but not with sympathy, with indignation. "Jake's been here every day working to keep this farm alive, and you—" She jabbed the papers at me, her mouth tight with scorn. "You come back with some phony proof and expect us to believe it? You've always been so desperate for attention, Susan. Always trying to stir up trouble." It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My chest was so tight I could barely breathe, and when I spoke, my voice trembled despite my best effort. "They're not fake. You can call the bank yourself if you don't believe me." But the moment the words left my mouth, I knew it was pointless. No one reached for the phone. No one even looked at the papers. They just stood there, united against me, always siding with Jake, and I was left stranded, a stranger in my own family. Dad tossed the receipts onto the table with a flick of his wrist, like they were nothing more than trash. I stared at him, stunned, anger and disbelief warring inside me. "I can't believe this," I said, my voice rising, shaking as everything I'd been holding inside broke loose. "Even when I show you the proof, right here, black and white, you still defend him. Unbelievable. I've spent months helping you keep this place afloat, and you give Jake the credit and call me a liar." Jake just crossed his arms, leaning against the counter, that familiar smug look twisting his mouth. "Don't be so dramatic, Susan," he said, shrugging as if this was all beneath him. "You've always been jealous. This isn't anything new." Something in me snapped, years of hurt and frustration boiling over. "You know what? I'm done. Don't expect me to ever come back here. I've had enough." I didn't even recognize my own voice. It was raw, final. Mom's face went tight, lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line, and Dad just shook his head again, like it was me who was broken, me who was the problem. I didn't trust myself to speak again. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me so hard the walls rattled. The cold air outside slapped me awake, stinging my cheeks, but honestly, it felt better than staying in that house another second. The farm, the land, the people. I'd given so much to all of it, and in the end, none of it mattered. By the time I got back to Chicago, the adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a numb exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue, a hard certainty took root. I was finished. No more bending over backwards for people who couldn't see the truth when it was staring them in the face. I unpacked in silence, the weight of what I'd left behind settling over me. And yet, it was a relief. For the first time in years, I felt like the ground under my feet was my own. The next morning, before I could second-guess myself, I went to the bank. "No more transfers to that account," I told the teller, my voice steady, even though a storm of anger still churned inside me. Cutting off the money felt strange, like severing a lifeline, a cord that had kept me tethered to the farm and everything it represented. But more than anything, it felt freeing. I realized, standing there in the sterile bank lobby, that for years I'd been carrying a burden that never really belonged to me, trying to fix things, trying to prove myself to people who never wanted to see me for who I was. At first, I thought I'd feel guilty. I braced for the regret, the pang of longing that usually came after a fight. But it never came. Every time I remembered Jake's smug grin, or the look of disgust on Dad's face, or the way Mom refused to even consider that I might be telling the truth, it just made me more certain. Let Jake handle the mess now. Let him be the hero he always pretended to be. The golden boy who could do no wrong. I wasn't going to keep throwing money at a farm that treated me like an outsider. If they wanted to believe his lies, then they could deal with the fallout when the bills started stacking up. And they would. Because Jake didn't have a dime to his name, and he'd never had to handle consequences before. The months crawled by. 6 of them, each one quieter than the last. Not a word from my family. No calls, no letters, not even an email. At first, I kept expecting the phone to ring, expecting Mom's number to pop up with some excuse, some plea for help. But the silence held. Sometimes I thought about them, about the farm, about the way things used to be before everything fell apart. But each time, the anger and hurt came crashing back, sharp and fresh, so I shoved it aside and poured myself into my work. I built a life in the city, one that wasn't defined by other people's expectations. Then, one humid afternoon in the middle of summer, there was a knock at my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened it, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. Mom and Dad stood there in the hallway, looking older, heavier, worn down by something I couldn't quite name. They looked almost lost, their eyes darting everywhere but at me. For a second I just stared, caught off guard by the sight of them so far from the farm. "Can we come in?" Dad asked, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard, stripped of its usual certainty. Mom stood next to him, white-knuckling her purse, her lips pressed so thin they were almost invisible. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to slam the door in their faces, to protect myself from whatever they were about to say. But curiosity, or maybe some leftover hope, won out. I stepped aside and watched them shuffle into my tiny apartment, looking out of place on my battered couch, glancing around as if searching for the right words. "What do you want?" I finally asked, my arms crossed, leaning against the chair. I didn't have the energy for small talk. I just wanted to know why they'd come. Dad cleared his throat, staring at the floor like he couldn't bear to look at me. "Susan," he started, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, thick with something like regret. "We owe you an apology. A big one." Mom nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. "We were wrong," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't believe you when you tried to tell us the truth, and we need to make it right. We should have listened. We should have trusted you." I just leaned back, my arms folded tighter across my chest, keeping my heart guarded. "Go on," I said, maybe sharper than I meant, but I couldn't help it. Years of being dismissed, ignored, erased. It wasn't going to vanish in a single conversation. Dad let out a long, weary sigh. "After you left, everything started falling apart on the farm. Bills piled up. Equipment broke down and we couldn't get it fixed. Jake, well, he didn't handle things the way he said he would. He made excuses, blamed everyone but himself, and the money just kept disappearing." He paused, rubbing his hands together, searching for the words. "We kept hoping things would get better, that maybe you'd come back and help us sort it out. But Jake, he couldn't keep up. He didn't have the money, and he didn't have your sense for the business. We saw the bank statements. We saw what you had been doing for us all along. You were right, Susan. We should have listened." Mom's eyes were shiny with tears, her face crumpling as she finally looked at me. "We're sorry. We're so sorry for how we treated you. We let Jake fool us and we let you down. I know it's too much to ask, but is there any way you can forgive us? Or at least let us try to make things right?" For a long moment I didn't say anything. I watched them, These people who had always seemed so certain, so stubborn, now humbled, desperate for forgiveness. It was strange seeing my parents like this, stripped of their pride and excuses. Part of me wanted to reach out, to cling to the hope that maybe things could change. But another part, the part that had learned to survive on its own, held back. I didn't know what I was going to say. But for the first time the choice was mine. And whatever happened next, it wouldn't be about proving myself to them. It would be about what I wanted, what I deserved. I let that thought settle in, and for the first time in a long while I felt something like peace. We never had much, not really. Every season we hoped the crops would pull us through. But each year, the yield shrank and the bills grew. There were nights I'd see the worry lines deepen on Dad's face, or hear Mom crying softly behind the kitchen door. Yet, through it all, Jake would swagger around, telling us not to worry, that he was handling things. He always said he'd figure it out, and we clung to that, desperate for something to believe in. Maybe it was easier to trust him than to admit how close we were to losing everything. But deep down I think we all knew he was in over his head. When the truth finally came to light, it didn't happen in some dramatic confrontation. It was quieter, heavier. We'd pressed Jake until he couldn't dodge anymore, and at last he broke. My mom's voice trembled, her hands shaking, when she told me what he'd confessed. I watched her eyes fill up, not just with tears, but with the kind of grief that comes from realizing you've been blind to the truth. She told me. He admitted it, Susan. You were the one who kept making those deposits all those months. You were the one keeping us from going under. The whole room fell silent as the weight of her words hit us. It wasn't just Jake's lie that stunned them, but the realization that they'd dismissed me again and again, never really listening when I tried to explain myself. Mom reached for me, her voice breaking. We're sorry, Susan. We're so sorry. For doubting you, for treating you the way we did, for everything. You didn't deserve any of it. She looked at me like she wanted to take it all back, but there's no way to erase the past. I looked at them, really looked, and saw regret written on every line of their faces. For the first time I recognized something almost foreign in them. Real shame. Not just guilt for being caught, but a deep, unsettling shame over how they'd failed me. My dad finally met my gaze, his voice rough. We're asking for your forgiveness, Susan. I know we haven't earned it, but we needed you to hear the truth from us. You saved the farm. We owe you more than just these words. I let their apology hang between us. Part of me wanted to let them stew in their regret, to let the silence stretch long enough for them to truly feel the hurt they'd caused. It was tempting after all the months of being shut out and called a liar. But finally I spoke, my voice steady but edged with the anger I'd been holding inside. Where's Jake? The question cut through the tension, and I could see both of them tense up. Mom glanced at Dad, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse. He's still at the farm, she said softly. He wanted to come, but we thought it would be better if we spoke to you first. Dad nodded, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He's been keeping to himself since all this came out. He's ashamed, Susan. More than I've ever seen him. Ashamed. I echoed, letting out a sharp, bitter laugh. That's something. Ashamed now, after months of letting you all think I was the problem. After he took credit for everything I did to keep us afloat. Dad dropped his eyes, color draining from his face. You're right, he said, barely above a whisper. We let it happen. We let it go on because it was easier than facing what was really happening. We failed you too. Jake, he wanted us to say he's sorry. He doesn't expect forgiveness, but he needed us to tell you. I couldn't help the anger that bubbled up. He wanted you to tell me. I shot back, my voice rising. So he still can't face me himself. He still needs you to protect him even now. After everything, you're still cleaning up his mess. My words hung in the air, sharper than I intended, but I didn't regret them. For so long I'd tiptoed around their feelings, careful not to rock the boat. But now, with the truth finally out, I was done pretending. Mom opened her mouth, but I cut her off. Do you even hear how that sounds? He gets to hide while you play messenger. He gets to be ashamed in private, But I had to live with your accusations, your suspicion day after day. You say you're sorry, but you're still giving him the easy way out. Dad's hands tightened around his knees. We thought it might be easier, he mumbled. Easier for who? I demanded. For Jake. For you. Because it sure as hell isn't easier for me. The room went quiet again. A silence so heavy I wondered if it would ever lift. Mom stared down, her knuckles white, and Dad just sat there, jaw clenched, unable to look at me. Finally, Dad stood up, shoulders slumped. You're right, he said quietly. We should have brought him. We should have made him face you, made him see what he did. We've been making excuses for him for so long, we don't even know how to stop. Mom stood too, clutching her purse, her eyes red and raw. We're sorry, Susan, she whispered. You deserved so much better. We all failed you. Without waiting for me to respond, they left. Dad paused at the door, that lost, hollow look on his face, and then they slipped out, the door clicking shut behind them. I just sat there, the silence pressing in around me, thick with the ghosts of all those unspoken apologies. For the first time, I felt like they finally saw me, not just as their daughter or the person they doubted, but as someone who had quietly shouldered the burden they couldn't bear. Their shame lingered in the apartment long after they were gone. A week went by before I heard another knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my heart started to race as I crossed the room. When I opened the door, there was Jake standing in the hallway, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were rimmed with red, his shoulders hunched, hands jammed deep into his jacket pockets. He looked so small, so unlike the brother I thought I knew. Susan, he said, his voice rough and hesitant. Can I come in for a minute? Part of me wanted to slam the door, to finally give him a taste of the rejection I'd felt. But I didn't. I stepped aside and let him in, saying nothing. He stood in the middle of the room, awkward, not quite knowing what to do with himself. He didn't take off his coat, didn't sit. He just shifted from foot to foot, staring at the floor. I came to apologize, he managed after a long pause. His voice barely more than a whisper. For everything. For lying about the money. For letting Mom and Dad treat you the way they did. For letting you carry all that alone. He finally looked up, and I saw that whatever bravado he used to have was gone, stripped away by the truth and the shame of what he'd done. His voice cracked, and for the first time I believed he really understood the damage he'd caused. He took a shaky breath. I was scared, Susan. I didn't know how to fix things, and I was too proud to ask for help. When you started sending money, it felt like a lifeline, and I let them believe it was me because I couldn't face what I'd become. I wanted so badly to be the one who saved the farm, to be the hero. But I wasn't. You were. He wiped at his eyes, and I realized how hard it must have been for him to come here to say these words. I still didn't know if I could forgive him, not yet. But I saw in that moment that he was finally telling the truth. Not just to me but to himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. I stood there in the heavy silence, my arms crossed, unsure whether I was bracing myself or simply holding myself together. Jake's words hung in the air between us, raw and unvarnished. He didn't try to explain away his actions, didn't search for easy justifications. I was jealous of you, Susan. I've always been jealous. You've actually done something with your life, and I just stayed put. His voice trembled, the admission coming from a place deeper than shame, almost like he was confessing to himself as much as to me. He exhaled shakily, the kind of breath that sounds like it's trying to carry years of regret out of his body. I thought if I could just keep their approval, maybe I'd feel important. But I was wrong. All of it was wrong. His words broke apart, and then so did he. Jake's shoulders shook as he dropped his head into his hands, tears spilling out in great messy gulps, the kind of crying I'd never seen from him before. It was as if his whole life had finally caught up to him in this one moment. No pride left, no walls to hide behind. There was nothing performative about it. This was grief and guilt and desperation all tangled together. For the first time I saw past the bravado and the bad decisions. straight into the small, hurting boy he must have been for so long. He didn't even try to compose himself. He just let the pain come, unfiltered and unhidden. And I, for all my anger, found myself paralyzed. Not out of coldness, but because I simply didn't know how to reach across that gulf, or if I even wanted to. After that day, something shifted in the fabric of our family. Subtle but undeniable. My parents didn't call immediately. There was a kind of awkwardness in the air, as though we were all walking over ground newly broken open. But when they finally did, there was a softness in their voices I hadn't heard before, a carefulness I wasn't used to. Gone was the automatic defensiveness, the instinct to shield Jake from consequences or brush things under the rug. There were no more attempts to pretend he hadn't hurt me, or to minimize the mess that had driven us apart. They never said the words "we were wrong," but they didn't have to. Something in the way they spoke, the little hesitations, told me they'd finally seen the truth of what I'd been carrying for years. Dad mentioned that he and Mom had started overseeing the farm finances again, not as a punishment but as a way to regain some control, to set things right. Mom, always careful with her words, let slip that Jake was trying, really trying, to make amends, to repair what he'd broken, not just with me, but with all of us. It wasn't everything and it wasn't perfect, but it was more than I'd dared to hope for. Jake kept his distance after that. He didn't come around with apologies or try to patch up our relationship with empty gestures, and honestly, I found comfort in that slow, quiet distance. Trust, I realized, is something that grows back in increments, if it ever grows back at all. But knowing that my parents had finally opened their eyes to the reality I'd been living, that they no longer saw Jake through the old, forgiving lens, brought me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. There was still hurt, still so much unsaid, but at least now the balance was shifting. Things were still messy, still complicated, but I could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that the truth was out in the open. Our family would never be picture perfect, maybe it never was, and maybe that was okay. But for the first time it felt like we were moving toward something a little more honest, a little more fair. And for me, that was enough to start letting go of some of the old pain, to imagine a future that wasn't defined by secrets and silence. If this story resonated with you, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. Your support makes a huge difference and ensures you won't miss any of the stories we share here. Thank you so much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time.